19. Christian Apologetics. This was read to the Anglican Carmarthen Conference for Youth Leaders and Junior Clergy at Easter 1945. It was subsequently published in Undeceptions 1971 and later in Compelling Reason 1998. Some of you are priests and some are leaders of youth organizations. I have little right to address either. It is for priests to teach me, not for me to teach them. I have never helped to organize youth, and while I was young myself, I successfully avoided being organized. If I address you, it is in response to a request so urged that I came to regard compliance as a matter of obedience. I am to talk about apologetics. Apologetics means, of course, defense. The first question is, what do you propose to defend? Christianity, of course, and Christianity as understood by the Church in Wales. And here at the outset I must deal with an unpleasant business. It seems to the layman that in the Church of England we often hear from our priests doctrine which is not Anglican Christianity. It may depart from Anglican Christianity in either of two ways. One, it may be so broad or liberal or modern that it in fact excludes any real supernaturalism and thus ceases to be Christian at all. 2. It may, on the other hand, be Roman. It is not, of course, for me to define to you what Anglican Christianity is. I am your pupil, not your teacher. But I insist that wherever you draw the lines, bounding lines must exist, beyond which your doctrine will cease either to be Anglican or to be Christian. And I suggest also that the lines come a great deal sooner than many modern priests think. I think it is your duty to fix the lines clearly in your own minds, and if you wish to go beyond them, you must change your profession. This is your duty not specially as Christians or as priests, but as honest men. There is a danger here of the clergy developing a special professional conscience which obscures the very plain moral issue. Men who have passed beyond these boundary lines in either direction are apt to protest that they have come by their unorthodox opinions honestly. In defense of these opinions, they are prepared to suffer obloquy and to forfeit professional advancement. They thus come to feel like martyrs. But this simply misses the point which so gravely scandalizes the layman. We never doubted that the unorthodox opinions were honestly held. What we complain of is your continuing your ministry after you have come to hold them. We always knew that a man who makes his living as a paid agent of the Conservative Party may honestly change his views and honestly become a communist. What we deny is that he can honestly continue to be a Conservative agent and to receive money from one party while he supports the policy of another. Even when we have thus ruled out teaching which is in direct contradiction to our profession, we must define our task still further. We are to defend Christianity itself, the faith preached by the apostles, attested by the martyrs, embodied in the creeds, expounded by the fathers. This must be clearly distinguished from the whole of what any one of us may think about God and man. Each of us has his individual emphasis. Each holds, in addition to the faith, many opinions which seem to him to be consistent with it and true and important. And so perhaps they are. But as apologists, it is not our business to defend them. We are defending Christianity, not my religion. When we mention our personal opinions, we must always make quite clear the difference between them and the faith itself. St. Paul has given us the model in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 25. On a certain point he has no commandment of the Lord, but gives his judgment. No one is left in doubt as to the difference in status implied. This distinction, which is demanded by honesty, also gives the apologist a great tactical advantage. The great difficulty is to get modern audiences to realize that you are preaching Christianity solely and simply because you happen to think it true. They always suppose you are preaching it because you like it, or think it good for society, or something of that sort. Now, a clearly maintained distinction between what the faith actually says and what you would like it to have said, or what you understand, or what you personally find helpful or think probable, forces your audience to realize that you are tied to your data just as the scientist is tied by the results of the experiments, that you are not just saying what you like. This immediately helps them to realize that what is being discussed is a question about objective fact, not gas about ideals and points of view. Secondly, this scrupulous care to preserve the Christian message as something distinct from one's own ideas has one very good effect upon the apologist himself. It forces him, again and again, to face up to those elements in original Christianity which he personally finds obscure or repulsive. He is saved from the temptation to skip or slur or ignore what he finds disagreeable. And the man who yields to that temptation will, of course, never progress in Christian knowledge. For obviously, the doctrines which one finds easy are the doctrines which give Christian sanction to truths you already knew. The new truth, which you do not know and which you need, must, in the very nature of things, be hidden precisely in the doctrines you least like and least understand. It is just the same here as in science. The phenomenon which is troublesome, which doesn't fit in with the current scientific theories, is the phenomenon which compels reconsideration, and thus leads to new knowledge. Science progresses because scientists, instead of running away from such troublesome phenomena or hushing them up, are constantly seeking them out. In the same way, there will be progress in Christian knowledge only as long as we accept the challenge of the difficult or repellent doctrines. A liberal Christianity, which considers itself free to alter the faith whenever the faith looks perplexing or repellent, must be completely stagnant. Progress is made only into a resisting material. From this, there follows a corollary about the apologist's private reading. There are two questions he will naturally ask himself. 1. Have I been keeping abreast of recent movements in theology? 2. Have I stood firm, super monstratus vias, amidst all these winds of doctrine? Ephesians chapter 4, verse 14. I want to say emphatically that the second question is far the more important of the two. Our upbringing and the whole atmosphere of the world we live in make it certain that our main temptation will be that of yielding to winds of doctrine, not that of ignoring them. We are not at all likely to be hidebound. We are very likely indeed to be the slaves of fashion. If one has to choose between reading the new books and reading the old, one must choose the old. Not because they are necessarily better, but because they contain precisely those truths of which our own age is neglectful. The standard of permanent Christianity must be kept clear in our minds, and it is against that standard that we must test all contemporary thought. In fact, we must at all costs not move with the times. We serve one who said, "Heaven and earth shall move with the times, but my words shall not move with the times." Matthew chapter 24, verse 35, Mark chapter 13, verse 31, Luke chapter 21, verse 33. I am speaking so far of theological reading. Scientific reading is a different matter. If you know any science, it is very desirable that you should keep it up. We have to answer the current scientific attitude towards Christianity, not the attitude which scientists adopted 100 years ago. Science is in continual change, and we must try to keep abreast of it. For the same reason, we must be very cautious of snatching at any scientific theory which, for the moment, seems to be in our favour. We may mention such things, but we must mention them lightly and without claiming that they are more than interesting. Sentences beginning, "Science has now proved," should be avoided. If we try to base our apologetic on some recent development in science, we shall usually find that just as we have put the finishing touches to our argument, science has changed its mind and quietly withdrawn the theory we have been using as our foundation stone. Timeo Danaos et dona ferentes is a sound principle. While we are on the subject of science, let me digress for a moment. I believe that any Christian who is qualified to write a good popular book on any science may do much more good by that than by any directly apologetic work. The difficulty we are up against is this. We can make people often attend to the Christian point of view for half an hour or so. But the moment they have gone away from our lecture or laid down our article, they are plunged back into a world where the opposite position is taken for granted. Every newspaper, film, novel, and textbook undermines our work. As long as that situation exists, widespread success is simply impossible. We must attack the enemy's line of communication. What we want is not more little books about Christianity, but more little books by Christians on other subjects, with their Christianity latent. You can see this most easily if you look at it the other way round. Our faith is not very likely to be shaken by any book on Hinduism. But if, whenever we read an elementary book on geology, botany, politics, or astronomy, we found that its implications were Hindu, that would shake us. It is not the books written in direct defense of materialism that make the modern man a materialist. It is the materialistic assumptions in all the other books. In the same way, it is not books on Christianity that will really trouble him. But he would be troubled if, whenever he wanted a cheap, popular introduction to some science, the best work on the market was always by a Christian. The first step to the reconversion of the country is a series produced by Christians which can beat the Penguins and the Thinkers' Library on their own ground. Its Christianity would have to be latent, not explicit, and, of course, its science perfectly honest. Science twisted in the interests of apologetics would be sin and folly. But I must return to my immediate subject. Our business is to present that which is timeless, the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, Hebrews chapter 8, verse 8, in the particular language of our own age. The bad preacher does exactly the opposite. He takes the ideas of our own age and tricks them out in the traditional language of Christianity. Thus, for example, he may think about the Beveridge Report and talk about the coming of the kingdom. The core of his thought is merely contemporary. Only the superficies is traditional. But your teaching must be timeless at its heart and wear a modern dress. This raises the question of theology and politics. The nearest I can get to a settlement of the frontier problem between them is this: that theology teaches us what ends are desirable and what means are lawful, while politics teaches us what means are effective. Thus theology tells us that every man ought to have a decent wage. Politics tells us by what means this is likely to be attained. Theology tells us which of these means are consistent with justice and charity. On the political question, guidance comes not from revelation, but from natural prudence, knowledge of complicated facts, and ripe experience. If we have these qualifications, we may, of course, state our political opinions. But then we must make it quite clear that we are giving our personal judgment and have no command from the Lord. Not many priests have these qualifications. Most political sermons teach the congregation nothing except what newspapers are taken at the rectory. Our great danger at present is lest the Church should continue to practice a merely missionary technique in what has become a missionary situation. A century ago, our task was to edify those who had been brought up in the faith. Our present task is chiefly to convert and instruct infidels. Great Britain is as much a part of the mission field as China. Now, if you were sent to the Bantus, you would be taught their language and traditions. You need similar teaching about the language and mental habits of your own uneducated and unbelieving fellow countrymen. Many priests are quite ignorant on this subject. What I know about it, I have learned from talking in RAF camps. They were mostly inhabited by Englishmen, and, therefore, some of what I shall say may be irrelevant to the situation in Wales. You will sift out what does not apply. 1. I find that the uneducated Englishman is an almost total skeptic about history. I had expected he would disbelieve the Gospels because they contain miracles, but he really disbelieves them because they deal with things that happened 2,000 years ago. He would disbelieve equally in the Battle of Actium if he heard of it. To those who have had our kind of education, his state of mind is very difficult to realize. To us, the present has always appeared as one section in a huge continuous process. In his mind, the present occupies almost the whole field of vision. Beyond it, isolated from it, and quite unimportant, is something called the old days, a small comic jungle in which highwaymen, Queen Elizabeth, knights in armour, etc. wander about. Then, strangest of all, beyond the old days comes a picture of primitive man. He is science, not history, and is therefore felt to be much more real than the old days. In other words, the prehistoric is much more believed in than the historic. 2. He has a distrust, very rational in the state of his knowledge, of ancient texts. Thus a man has sometimes said to me, "These records were written in the days before printing, weren't they? And you haven't got the original bit of paper, have you?" So what it comes to is that someone wrote something, and someone else copied it, and someone else copied that, and so on. Well, by the time it comes to us, it won't be in the least like the original. This is a difficult objection to deal with, because one cannot, there and then, start teaching the whole science of textual criticism. But at this point their real religion, i.e. faith in science, has come to my aid. The assurance that there is a science called textual criticism, and that its results, not only as regards the New Testament, but as regards ancient texts in general, are generally accepted, will usually be received without objection. I need hardly point out that the word text must not be used, since to your audience it means only a scriptural quotation. 3. A sense of sin is almost totally lacking. Our situation is thus very different from that of the apostles. The pagans, and still more the Metuentes, to whom they preached, were haunted by a sense of guilt, and to them the gospel was, therefore, good news. We address people who have been trained to believe that whatever goes wrong in the world is someone else's fault. The capitalists, the governments, the Nazis, the generals, etc. They approach God himself as his judges. They want to know not whether they can be acquitted for sin, but whether he can be acquitted for creating such a world. In attacking this fatal insensibility, it is useless to direct attention, A, to sins your audience do not commit, or B, to things they do but do not regard as sins. They are usually not drunkards. They are mostly fornicators, but then they do not feel fornication to be wrong. It is, therefore, useless to dwell on either of these subjects. Now that contraceptives have removed the obviously uncharitable element in fornication, I do not myself think we can expect people to recognize it as a sin until they have accepted Christianity as a whole. I cannot offer you a watertight technique for awaking the sense of sin. I can only say that, in my experience, if one begins from the sin that has been one's own chief problem during the last week, one is very often surprised at the way this shaft goes home. But whatever method we use, our continual effort must be to get their minds away from public affairs and crime and bring them down to brass tacks, to the whole network of spite, greed, envy, unfairness, and conceit in the lives of ordinary, decent people like themselves and ourselves. 4. We must learn the language of our audience. And let me say at the outset that it is no use at all laying down a priori what the plain man does or does not understand. You have to find out by experience. Thus, most of us would have supposed that the change from "may truly and indifferently minister justice" to "may truly and impartially" made that place easier to the uneducated. But a priest of my acquaintance discovered his sexton saw no difficulty in "indifferently." "It means making no difference between one man and another," he said, but had no idea what "impartially" meant. On this question of language, the best thing I can do is to make a list of words which are used by people in a sense different from ours. Atonement does not really exist in a spoken modern English, though it would be recognized as a religious word. Insofar as it conveys any meaning to the uneducated, I think it means compensation. No one word will express to them what Christians mean by atonement. You must paraphrase. Being, noun, never means merely entity in popular speech. Often it means what we should call a personal being. E.g., a man said to me, "I believe in the Holy Ghost, but I don't think he is a being." Catholic means papistical. Charity means A. alms, B. a charitable organization, C. much more rarely, indulgence, i.e., a charitable attitude towards a man is conceived as one that denies or condones his sins, not as one that loves the sinner in spite of them. Christian has come to include almost no idea of belief, usually a vague term of approval. The question, "What do you call a Christian?" has been asked of me again and again. The answer they wish to receive is, A Christian is a decent chap who's unselfish, etc. Church means A. Sacred building, B. The clergy. Does not suggest to them the company of all faithful people. Generally used in a bad sense. Direct defence of the church is part of our duty, but use of the word church, where there is no time to defend it, alienates sympathy and should be avoided where possible. Creative now means merely talented, original. The idea of creation in the theological sense is absent from their minds. Creature means beast, irrational animal. Such an expression as, "we are only creatures," would almost certainly be misunderstood. Crucifixion, cross, etc. Centuries of hymnody and religious cant have so exhausted these words that they now very faintly, if at all, convey the idea of execution by torture. It is better to paraphrase, and, for the same reason, to say flogged, for New Testament scourged. Matthew chapter 27, verse 26, Mark chapter 15, verse 15, John chapter 19, verse 1. Dogma, used by the people only in a bad sense to mean unproved assertion delivered in an arrogant manner. Immaculate conception, in the mouth of an uneducated speaker, always means virgin birth. Morality means chastity. Personal. I had argued for at least 10 minutes with a man about the existence of a personal devil, before I discovered that personal meant to him corporeal. I suspect this of being widespread. When they say they don't believe in a personal God, they may often mean only that they are not anthropomorphists. Potential, when used at all, is used in an engineering sense. Never means possible. Primitive means crude, clumsy, unfinished, inefficient. Primitive Christianity would not mean to them at all what it does to you. Sacrifice has no associations with temple and altar. They are familiar with this word only in the journalistic sense. The nation must be prepared for heavy sacrifices. Spiritual means primarily immaterial, incorporeal, but with serious confusions from the Christian uses of pneuma. Hence the idea that whatever is spiritual, in the sense of non-sensuous, is somehow better than anything sensuous. E.g., they don't really believe that envy could be as bad as drunkenness. Vulgarity usually means obscenity or smut. There are bad confusions, and not only in uneducated minds, between A. the obscene or lascivious, what is calculated to provoke lust, B. the indecorous, what offends against good taste or propriety, C. the vulgar proper, what is socially low. Good people tend to think B as sinful as A, with the result that others feel A to be just as innocent as B. To conclude, you must translate every bit of your theology into the vernacular. This is very troublesome, and it means you can say very little in half an hour, but it is essential. It is also of the greatest service to your own thought. I have come to the conviction that if you cannot translate your thoughts into uneducated language, then your thoughts were confused. Power to translate is the test of having really understood one's own meaning. A passage from some theological work for translation into the vernacular ought to be a compulsory paper in every ordination examination. I turn now to the question of the actual attack. This may be either emotional or intellectual. If I speak only of the intellectual kind, that is not because I undervalue the other, because, not having been given the gifts necessary for carrying it out, I cannot give advice about it. But I wish to say most emphatically that where a speaker has that gift, the direct evangelical appeal of the come to Jesus type can be as overwhelming today as it was 100 years ago. I have seen it done, preluded by a religious film and accompanied by hymn singing, and with very remarkable effect. I cannot do it, but those who can ought to do it with all their might. I am not sure that the ideal missionary team ought not to consist of one who argues and one who, in the fullest sense of the word, preaches. Put up your arguer first to undermine their intellectual prejudices, then let the evangelist proper launch his appeal. I have seen this done with great success. But here I must concern myself only with the intellectual attack. non omnia possumus omnes. And first, a word of encouragement. Uneducated people are not irrational people. I have found that they will endure and can follow quite a lot of sustained argument if you go slowly. Often, indeed, the novelty of it, for they have seldom met it before, delights them. Do not attempt to water Christianity down. There must be no pretense that you can have it with the supernatural left out. So far as I can see, Christianity is precisely the one religion from which the miraculous cannot be separated. You must frankly argue for supernaturalism from the very outset. The two popular difficulties you will probably have to deal with are these. 1. Now that we know how huge the universe is and how insignificant the earth, it is ridiculous to believe that the universal God should be specially interested in our concerns. In answer to this, you must first correct their error about fact. The insignificance of Earth in relation to the universe is not a modern discovery. Nearly 2,000 years ago, Ptolemy, Almagest, Book 1, Chapter 5, said that in relation to the distance of the fixed stars, Earth must be treated as a mathematical point without magnitude. Secondly, you should point out that Christianity says what God has done for man. It doesn't say, because it doesn't know, what he has or has not done in other parts of the universe. Thirdly, you might recall the parable of the one lost sheep. Matthew chapter 18, verses 11 to 14, Luke chapter 15, verses 4 to 7. If Earth has been specially sought by God, which we don't know, that may not imply that it is the most important thing in the universe, but only that it has strayed. Finally, challenge the whole tendency to identify size and importance. Is an elephant more important than a man, or a man's leg than his brain? 2. People believed in miracles in the old days because they didn't know then that they were contrary to the laws of nature. But they did. If St. Joseph didn't know that a virgin birth was contrary to nature, i.e., if he didn't yet know the normal origin of babies, why, on discovering his wife's pregnancy, was he minded to put her away? Matthew chapter 1, verse 19. Obviously, no event would be recorded as a wonder unless the recorders knew the natural order and saw that this was an exception. If people didn't know that the sun rose in the east, they wouldn't even be interested in its once rising in the west. They were not recorded as a miraculum, nor indeed recorded at all. The very idea of miracle presupposes knowledge of the laws of nature. You can't have the idea of an exception until you have the idea of a rule. It is very difficult to produce arguments on the popular level for the existence of God, and many of the most popular arguments seem to me invalid. Some of these may be produced in discussion by friendly members of the audience. This raises the whole problem of the embarrassing supporter. It is brutal and dangerous to repel him. It is often dishonest to agree with what he says. I usually try to avoid saying anything about the validity of his argument in itself, and reply, "Yes, that may do for you and me, but I'm afraid if we take that line, our friend here on my left might say," etc., etc. Fortunately, though very oddly, I have found that people are usually disposed to hear the divinity of our Lord discussed before going into the existence of God. When I began, I used, if I were giving 2 lectures, to devote the first to mere theism, but I soon gave up this method because it seemed to arouse little interest. The number of clear and determined atheists is apparently not very large. When we come to the incarnation itself, I usually find that some form of the aut deus aut malus homo can be used. The majority of them started with the idea of the great human teacher, who was deified by his superstitious followers. It must be pointed out how very improbable this is among Jews, and how different to anything that happened with Plato, Confucius, Buddha, Muhammad. The Lord's own words and claims, of which many are quite ignorant, must be forced home. The whole case, on a popular level, is very well put indeed in Chesterton's Everlasting Man. Something will usually have to be said about the historicity of the Gospels. You who are trained theologians will be able to do this in ways which I could not. My own line was to say that I was a professional literary critic, and I thought I did know the difference between legend and historical writing. That the Gospels were certainly not legends. In one sense, they're not good enough. And that if they are not history, then they are realistic prose fiction of a kind which actually never existed before the 18th century. Little episodes such as Jesus writing in the dust, John chapter 8 verses 3 to 8, when they brought him the woman taken in adultery, which have no doctrinal significance at all, are the mark. One of the great difficulties is to keep before the audience's mind the question of truth. They always think you are recommending Christianity not because it is true, but because it is good. And in the discussion, they will at every moment try to escape from the issue, true or false, into stuff about a good society, or morals, or the incomes of bishops, or the Spanish Inquisition, or France, or Poland, or anything whatever. You have to keep forcing them back, and again back, to the real point. Only thus will you be able to undermine a. Their belief that a certain amount of religion is desirable, but one mustn't carry it too far. One must keep on pointing out that Christianity is a statement which, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The one thing it cannot be is moderately important. B. Their firm belief of Article 18. Of course, it should be pointed out that, though all salvation is through Jesus, we need not conclude that he cannot save those who have not explicitly accepted him in this life. And it should, at least in my judgment, be made clear that we are not pronouncing all other religions to be totally false, but rather saying that in Christ whatever is true in all religions is consummated and perfected. But, on the other hand, I think we must attack, wherever we meet it, the nonsensical idea that mutually exclusive propositions about God can both be true. For my own part, I have sometimes told my audience that the only two things really worth considering are Christianity and Hinduism. Islam is only the greatest of the Christian heresies, Buddhism only the greatest of the Hindu heresies, real paganism is dead. All that was best in Judaism and Platonism survives in Christianity. There isn't really, for an adult mind, this infinite variety of religions to consider. We may, salva reverentia, divide religions as we do soups, into thick and clear. By thick, I mean those which have orgies and ecstasies and mysteries and local attachments. Africa is full of thick religions. By clear, I mean those which are philosophical, ethical, and universalizing. Stoicism, Buddhism, and the ethical church are clear religions. And now, if there is a true religion, it must be both thick and clear. For the true God must have made both the child and the man, both the savage and the citizen, both the head and the belly. And the only two religions that fulfill this condition are Hinduism and Christianity. But Hinduism fulfills it imperfectly. A clear religion of the Brahmin hermit in the jungle and the thick religion of the neighboring temple go on side by side. The Brahmin hermit doesn't bother about the temple prostitution, nor the worshipper in the temple about the hermit's metaphysic. But Christianity really breaks down the middle wall of the partition. It takes a convert from Central Africa and tells him to obey an enlightened universalist ethic. It takes a 20th century academic prig like me and tells me to go fasting to a mystery, to drink the blood of the Lord. The savage convert has to be clear, I have to be thick. That is how one knows one has come to the real religion. One last word. I have found that nothing is more dangerous to one's own faith than the work of an apologist. No doctrine of that faith seems to me so spectral, so unreal, as one that I have just successfully defended in a public debate. For a moment, you see, it has seemed to rest on oneself. As a result, when you go away from that debate, it seems no stronger than that weak pillar. That is why we apologists take our lives in our hands and can be saved only by falling back continually from the web of our own arguments, as from our intellectual counters, into the reality, from Christian apologetics into Christ himself. That also is why we need one another's continual help. Oremus pro invicem. 13. Miracles. First published in The Guardian, 2nd of October 1942, the text was expanded and preached as a sermon in St. Jude on the Hill Church, London, subsequently appearing in St. Jude's Gazette, No. 73, October 1942. It was later published in Undeceptions, 1971, and is now in God in the Dock, 1998. I have known only one person in my life who claimed to have seen a ghost. It was a woman, and the interesting thing is that she disbelieved in the immortality of the soul before seeing the ghost, and still disbelieves after having seen it. She thinks it was a hallucination. In other words, seeing is not believing. This is the first thing to get clear in talking about miracles. Whatever experiences we may have, we shall not regard them as miraculous if we already hold a philosophy which excludes the supernatural. Any event which is claimed as a miracle is, in the last resort, an experience received from the senses, and the senses are not infallible. We can always say we have been the victims of an illusion. If we disbelieve in the supernatural, this is what we always shall say. Hence, whether miracles have really ceased or not, they would certainly appear to cease in Western Europe as materialism became the popular creed. For let us make no mistake, if the end of the world appeared in all the literal trappings of the apocalypse, the modern materialist saw with his own eyes the heavens rolled up, Revelation chapter 6, verse 14, and the great white throne appearing, chapter 20, verse 11. If he had the sensation of being himself hurled into the lake of fire, chapter 19, verse 20, chapter 20, verses 10, 14, and 15, chapter 21, verse 8, he would continue forever in that lake itself, to regard his experience as an illusion, and to find the explanation of it in psychoanalysis or cerebral pathology. Experience by itself proves nothing. If a man doubts whether he is dreaming or waking, no experiment can solve his doubt, since every experiment may itself be part of the dream. Experience proves this or that or nothing according to the preconceptions we bring to it. This fact, that the interpretation of experience depends on preconceptions, is often used as an argument against miracles. It is said that our ancestors, taking the supernatural for granted and greedy of wonders, read the miraculous into events that were really not miracles. And in a sense I grant it. That is to say, I think that just as our preconceptions would prevent us from apprehending miracles if they really occurred, so their preconceptions would lead them to imagine miracles even if they did not occur. In the same way, the doting man will think his wife faithful when she is not, and the suspicious man will not think her faithful when she is. The question of her actual fidelity remains meanwhile to be settled, if at all, on other grounds. But there is one thing often said about our ancestors which we must not say. We must not say, they believed in miracles because they did not know the laws of nature. This is nonsense. When St. Joseph discovered that his bride was pregnant, he was minded to put her away. Matthew chapter 1, verse 19. He knew enough biology for that. Otherwise, of course, he would not have regarded pregnancy as a proof of infidelity. When he accepted the Christian explanation, he regarded it as a miracle precisely because he knew enough of the laws of nature to know that this was a suspension of them. When the disciples saw Christ walking on the water, Matthew chapter 14, verse 26, Mark chapter 6, verse 49, John chapter 6, verse 19, they were frightened. They would not have been frightened unless they had known the laws of nature and known that this was an exception. If a man had no conception of a regular order in nature, then of course he could not notice departures from that order. Just as a dunce who does not understand the normal metre of a poem is also unconscious of the poet's variations from it. Nothing is wonderful except the abnormal, and nothing is abnormal until we have grasped the norm. Complete ignorance of the laws of nature would preclude the perception of the miraculous just as rigidly as complete disbelief in the supernatural precludes it, perhaps even more so. For while the materialist would have at least to explain miracles away, the man wholly ignorant of nature would simply not notice them. The experience of a miracle, in fact, requires two conditions. First, we must believe in a normal stability of nature, which means we must recognize that the data offered by our senses recur in regular patterns. Secondly, we must believe in some reality beyond nature. When both beliefs are held, and not till then, we can approach with an open mind the various reports which claim that this super or extra-natural reality has sometimes invaded and disturbed the sensuous content of space and time which makes our natural world. The belief in such a supernatural reality itself can neither be proved nor disproved by experience. The arguments for its existence are metaphysical and to me conclusive. They turn on the fact that even to think and act in the natural world, we have to assume something beyond it, and even assume that we partly belong to that something. In order to think, we must claim for our own reasoning a validity which is not credible if our thought is merely a function of our brain, and our brains a byproduct of irrational physical processes. In order to act above the level of mere impulse, we must claim a similar validity for our judgments of good and evil. In both cases, we get the same disquieting result. The concept of nature itself is one we have reached only tacitly by claiming a sort of supernatural status for ourselves. If we frankly accept this position and then turn to the evidence, we find, of course, that accounts of the supernatural meet us on every side. History is full of them, often in the same documents which we accept wherever they do not report miracles. Respectable missionaries report them not infrequently. The whole Church of Rome claims their continued occurrence. Intimate conversation elicits from almost every acquaintance at least one episode in his life which is what he would call queer or rum. No doubt most stories of miracles are unreliable, but then, as anyone can see by reading the papers, so are most stories of all events. Each story must be taken on its merits. What one must not do is to rule out the supernatural as the one impossible explanation. Thus you may disbelieve in the Mons angels because you cannot find a sufficient number of sensible people who say they saw them. But if you found a sufficient number, it would, in my view, be unreasonable to explain this by collective hallucination. For we know enough of psychology to know that spontaneous unanimity in hallucination is very improbable. And we do not know enough of the supernatural to know that a manifestation of angels is equally improbable. The supernatural theory is the less improbable of the two. When the Old Testament says that Sennacherib's invasion was stopped by angels, 2 Kings chapter 19 verse 35, and Herodotus says it was stopped by a lot of mice who came and ate up all the bowstrings of his army, an open-minded man will be on the side of the angels. Unless you start by begging the question, there is nothing intrinsically unlikely in the existence of angels, or in the action ascribed to them. But mice just don't do these things. A great deal of skepticism now current about the miracles of our Lord does not, however, come from disbelief of all reality beyond nature. It comes from two ideas which are respectable but I think mistaken. In the first place, modern people have an almost aesthetic dislike of miracles. Admitting that God can, they doubt if he would. To violate the laws he himself has imposed on his creation seems to them arbitrary, clumsy, a theatrical device only fit to impress savages, a solecism against the grammar of the universe. In the second place, many people confuse the laws of nature with the laws of thought, and imagine that their reversal or suspension would be a contradiction in terms, as if the resurrection of the dead were the same sort of thing as 2 and 2 making 5. I have only recently found the answer to the first objection. I found it first in George MacDonald, and later in St. Athanasius. This is what St. Athanasius says in his little book on the Incarnation. Our Lord took a body like ours and lived as a man, in order that those who had refused to recognize him in his superintendence and captaincy of the whole universe might come to recognize from the works he did here below in the body that what dwelled in this body was the Word of God. This accords exactly with Christ's own account of his miracles. The Son can do nothing of himself but what he seeth the Father do. John chapter 5 verse 19. The doctrine, as I understand it, is something like this. There is an activity of God displayed throughout creation, a wholesale activity, let us say, which men refuse to recognize. The miracles done by God incarnate, living as a man in Palestine, perform the very same things as this wholesale activity, but at a different speed and on a smaller scale. One of their chief purposes is that men, having seen a thing done by personal power on the small scale, may recognize, when they see the same thing done on the large scale, that the power behind it is also personal, is indeed the very same person who lived among us 2,000 years ago. The miracles, in fact, are a retelling in small letters of the very same story which is written across the whole world in letters too large for some of us to see. Of that larger script, part is already visible, part is still unsolved. In other words, some of the miracles do locally what God has already done universally. Others do locally what he has not yet done but will do. In that sense, and from our human point of view, some are reminders and others prophecies. God creates the vine, and teaches it to draw up water by its roots, and, with the aid of the sun, to turn that water into a juice which will ferment and take on certain qualities. Thus, every year, from Noah's time till ours, God turns water into wine. That men fail to see. Either, like the pagans, they refer the process to some finite spirit, Bacchus or Dionysus, or else, like the moderns, they attribute real and ultimate causality to the chemical and other material phenomena which are all that our senses can discover in it. But when Christ at Cana makes water into wine, the mask is off. John chapter 2, verses 1 to 11. The miracle has only half its effect if it only convinces us that Christ is God. It will have its full effect if, whenever we see a vineyard or drink a glass of wine, we remember that here works he who sat at the wedding party in Cana. Every year God makes a little corn into much corn. The seed is sown, and there is an increase, and men, according to the fashion of their age, say, "It is Ceres, it is Adonis, it is the corn king," or else, "It is the laws of nature." The close-up, the translation of this annual wonder, is the feeding of the 5,000. Matthew chapter 14, verses 15 to 21, Mark chapter 6, verses 34 to 44, Luke chapter 9, verses 12 to 17, John chapter 6, verses 1 to 11. Bread is not made there of nothing. Bread is not made of stones, as the devil once suggested to our Lord in vain. Matthew chapter 4, verse 3, Luke chapter 4, verse 3. A little bread is made into much bread. The Son will do nothing but what he sees the Father do. There is, so to speak, a family style. The miracles of healing fall into the same pattern. This is sometimes obscured for us by the somewhat magical view we tend to take of ordinary medicine. The doctors themselves do not take this view. The magic is not in the medicine, but in the patient's body. What the doctor does is to stimulate nature's functions in the body, or to remove hindrances. In a sense, though we speak for convenience of healing a cut, every cut heals itself. No dressing will make skin grow over a cut on a corpse. That same mysterious energy which we call gravitational when it steers the planets, and biochemical when it heals a body, is the efficient cause of all recoveries. And if God exists, that energy, directly or indirectly, is his. All who are cured by him, the healer within. But once he did it visibly, a man meeting a man. Where he does not work within in this mode, the organism dies. Hence, Christ's one miracle of destruction is also in harmony with God's wholesale activity. His bodily hand, held out in symbolic wrath, blasted a single fig tree. Matthew chapter 21, verse 19, Mark chapter 11, verses 13 to 20. But no tree died that year in Palestine, or any year, or in any land, or even ever will, save because he has done something, or, more likely, ceased to do something to it. When he fed the thousands, he multiplied fish as well as bread. Look in every bay and almost every river. This swarming, pulsating fecundity shows he is still at work. The ancients had a god called Genius, the god of animal and human fertility. the presiding spirit of gynecology, embryology, or the marriage bed, the genial bed, as they called it after its god Genius. As the miracles of wine and bread and healing showed who Bacchus really was, who Ceres, who Apollo, and that all were one, so this miraculous multiplication of fish reveals the real genius. And with that we stand at the threshold of the miracle which, for some reason, most offends modern ears. I can understand the man who denies the miraculous altogether. But what does one make of the people who admit some miracles but deny the virgin birth? Is it that for all their lip service to the laws of nature, there is only one law of nature that they really believe? Or is it that they see in this miracle a slur upon sexual intercourse, which is rapidly becoming the one thing venerated in a world without veneration? No miracle is, in fact, more significant. What happens in ordinary generation? What is a father's function in the act of begetting? A microscopic particle of matter from his body fertilizes the female. And with that microscopic particle passes, it may be, the colour of his hair, and his great-grandfather's hanging lip, and the human form in all its complexity of bones, liver, sinews, heart, and limbs, and pre-human form which the embryo will recapitulate in the womb. Behind every spermatozoon lies the whole history of the universe. Locked within it is no small part of the world's future. That is God's normal way of making a man, a process that takes centuries, beginning with the creation of matter itself, and narrowing to 1 second and 1 particle at the moment of begetting. And once again, men will mistake the sense impressions which this creative act throws off for the act itself, or else refer it to some finite being such as genius. Once, therefore, God does it directly, instantaneously, without a spermatozoon, without the millenniums of organic history behind the spermatozoon. There was, of course, another reason. This time he was creating not simply a man, but the man who was to be himself, the only true man. The process which leads to the spermatozoon has carried down with it through the centuries much undesirable silt. The life which reaches us by that normal route is tainted. To avoid that taint, to give humanity a fresh start, he once short-circuited the process. There is a vulgar anti-God paper which some anonymous donor sends me every week. In it recently I saw the taunt that we Christians believe in a God who committed adultery with the wife of a Jewish carpenter. The answer to that is that if you describe the action of God in fertilizing Mary as adultery, then, in that sense, God would have committed adultery with every woman who ever had a baby. For what he did once without a human father, he does always, even when he uses a human father as his instrument. For the human father in ordinary generation is only a carrier, sometimes an unwilling carrier, always the last in a long line of carriers of life that comes from the supreme life. Thus the filth that our poor, muddled, sincere, resentful enemies fling at the Holy One either does not stick, or, sticking, turns into glory. So much for the miracles which do, small and quick, what we have already seen in the large letters of God's universal activity. But before I go on to the second class, those which foreshadow parts of the universal activity we have not yet seen, I must guard against a misunderstanding. Do not imagine I am trying to make the miracles less miraculous. I am not arguing that they are more probable because they are less unlike natural events. I am trying to answer those who think them arbitrary, theatrical, unworthy of God, meaningless interruptions of universal order. They remain, in my view, wholly miraculous. To do instantly with dead and baked corn what ordinarily happens slowly with live seed is just as great a miracle as to make bread of stones. Just as great, but a different kind of miracle. That is the point. When I open Ovid or Grimm, I find the sort of miracles which really would be arbitrary. Trees talk, houses turn into trees, magic rings raise tables richly spread with food in lonely places, ships become goddesses, and men are changed into snakes or birds or bears. It is fun to read about. The least suspicion that it had really happened would turn that fun into nightmare. You find no miracles of that kind in the Gospels. Such things, if they could be, would prove that some alien power was invading nature. They would not in the least prove that it was the same power which had made nature and rules her every day. But the true miracles express not simply a God, but God, that which is outside nature not as a foreigner, but as her sovereign. They announce not merely that a king has visited our town, but that it is the king, our king. The second class of miracles, on this view, foretell what God has not yet done, but will do universally. He raised one man, the man who was himself, from the dead, because he will one day raise all men from the dead. Perhaps not only men, for there are hints in the New Testament that all creation will eventually be rescued from decay, restored to shape, and subserve the splendor of remade humanity. The Transfiguration, Matthew chapter 17 verses 1 to 9, Mark chapter 9 verses 2 to 10, and the walking on the water, Matthew chapter 14 verse 26, Mark chapter 6 verse 49, John chapter 6 verse 19, are glimpses of the beauty and the effortless power over all matter which will belong to men when they are really waked by God. Now, resurrection certainly involves reversal of natural process, in the sense that it involves a series of changes moving in the opposite direction to those we see. At death, matter which has been organic falls back gradually into the inorganic, to be finally scattered and used perhaps in other organisms. Resurrection would be the reverse process. It would not, of course, mean the restoration to each personality of those very atoms, numerically the same, which had made its first or natural body. There would not be enough to go round, for one thing, and for another, the unity of the body, even in this life, was consistent with a slow but perplexed change of its actual ingredients. But it certainly does mean matter of some kind rushing towards organism as we now see it rushing away. It means, in fact, playing backwards a film we have already seen played forwards. In that sense, it is reversal of nature. But, of course, it is a further question whether reversal in this sense is necessarily contradiction. Do we know that the film cannot be played backwards? Well, in one sense, it is precisely the teaching of modern physics that the film never works backwards. For modern physics, as you have heard before, the universe is running down. Disorganization and chance are continually increasing. There will come a time, not infinitely remote, when it will be wholly run down, or wholly disorganized, and science knows of no possible return from that state. There must have been a time, not infinitely remote, in the past, when it was wound up, though science knows of no winding-up process. The point is that for our ancestors the universe was a picture. For modern physics it is a story. If the universe is a picture, these things either appear in that picture or not, and if they don't, since it is an infinite picture, one may suspect that they are contrary to the nature of things. But a story is a different matter, especially if it is an incomplete story. And the story told by modern physics might be told briefly in the words, Humpty Dumpty was falling. That is, it proclaims itself an incomplete story. There must have been a time before he fell, when he was sitting on the wall. There must be a time after he has reached the ground. It is quite true that science knows of no horses and men who can put him together again once he has reached the ground and broken. But then, she also knows of no means by which he could originally have been put on the wall. You wouldn't expect her to. All science rests on observation. All our observations are taken during Humpty Dumpty's fall, because we were born after he lost his seat on the wall, and shall be extinct long before he reaches the ground. But to assume from observations taken while the clock is running down that the unimaginable winding up which must have preceded this process cannot occur when the process is over is the merest dogmatism. From the very nature of the case, the laws of degradation and disorganization which we find in matter at present cannot be the ultimate and eternal nature of things. If they were, there would have been nothing to degrade and disorganize. Humpty Dumpty can't fall off a wall that never existed. Obviously, an event which lies outside the falling or disintegrating process which we know as nature is not imaginable. If anything is clear from the records of our Lord's appearances after his resurrection, it is that the risen body was very different from the body that died, and that it lives under conditions quite unlike those of natural life. It is frequently not recognized by those who see it. Luke chapter 24, verses 13 to 31 and 36 to 37. John chapter 20, verses 14 to 16. And it is not related to space in the same way as our bodies. The sudden appearances and disappearances, Mark chapter 16, verse 14, Luke chapter 24, verses 31 and 36, John chapter 20, verses 19 and 26, suggest the ghost of popular tradition. Yet he emphatically insists that he is not merely a spirit, and takes steps to demonstrate that the risen body can still perform animal operations, such as eating. Luke chapter 24, verses 42 and 43, John chapter 21, verse 13. What makes all this baffling to us is our assumption that to pass beyond what we call nature, beyond the 3 dimensions and the 5 highly specialized and limited senses, is immediately to be in a world of pure negative spiritually, a world where space of any sort and sense of any sort have no function. I know no grounds for believing this. To explain even an atom, Schrödinger wants 7 dimensions, and give us new senses, and we should find a new nature. There may be natures piled upon natures, each supernatural to the one beneath it, before we come to the abyss of pure spirit. And to be in that abyss, at the right hand of the Father, may not mean being absent from any of these natures, may mean a yet more dynamic presence on all levels. That is why I think it very rash to assume that the story of the Ascension is mere allegory. I know it sounds like the work of people who imagined an absolute up and down and a local heaven in the sky. But to say this is, after all, to say, assuming that the story is fake, we could thus explain how it arose. Without that assumption, we find ourselves moving about in worlds unrealized, with no probability or improbability to guide us. For if the story is true, then a being still in some mode, though not our mode, corporeal, withdrew at his own will from the nature presented by our 3 dimensions and 5 senses, not necessarily into the non-sensuous and undimensioned, but possibly into or through a world or worlds of supersense and superspace. And he might choose to do it gradually. Who on earth knows what the spectators might see? If they say they saw a momentary movement along the vertical plane, then an indistinct mass, then nothing, who is to pronounce this improbable? My time is nearly up, and I must be very brief with the second class of people whom I promised to deal with. Those who mistake the laws of nature for laws of thought, and, therefore, think that any departure from them is a self-contradiction, like a square circle or 2 and 2 making 5. To think this is to imagine that the normal processes of nature are transparent to the intellect, that we can say why she behaves as she does. For, of course, if we cannot see why a thing is so, then we cannot see any reason why it should not be otherwise. But in fact, the actual course of nature is wholly inexplicable. I don't mean that science has not yet explained it, but may do some day. I mean that the very nature of explanation makes it impossible that we should even explain why matter has the properties it has. For explanation, by its very nature, deals with a world of ifs and ands. Every explanation takes the form, since A, therefore B, or if C, then D. In order to explain any event, you have to assume the universe as a going concern, a machine working in a particular way. Since this particular way of working is the basis of all explanation, it can never be itself explained. We can see no reason why it should not have worked a different way. To say this is not only to remove the suspicion that miracle is self-contradictory, but also to realize how deeply right St. Athanasius was when he found an essential likeness between the miracles of our Lord and the general order of nature. Both are a full stop for the explaining intellect. If the natural means that which can be fitted into a class, that which obeys a norm, that which can be paralleled, that which can be explained by reference to other events, then nature herself as a whole is not natural. If a miracle means that which must simply be accepted, the unanswerable actuality which gives no account of itself but simply is, then the universe is one great miracle. To direct us to that great miracle is one main object of the earthly acts of Christ. They are, as he himself said, signs. Matthew chapter 12 verse 39, chapter 16 verse 4, chapter 24 verses 24 and 30, Mark chapter 13 verse 22, chapter 16 verses 17 and 20, Luke chapter 21 verses 11 and 25. They serve to remind us that the explanations of particular events which we derived from the given, the unexplained, the almost willful character of the actual universe are not explanations of that character. These signs do not take us away from reality, they recall us to it, recall us from our dream world of ifs and ands to the stunning actuality of everything that is real. They are focal points at which more reality becomes visible than we ordinarily see at once. I have spoken of how he made miraculous bread and wine, and of how, when the Virgin conceived, he had shown himself the true genius whom men had ignorantly worshipped long before. It goes deeper than that. Bread and wine were to have an even more sacred significance for Christians, and the act of generation was to be the chosen symbol among all mystics for the union of the soul with God. These things are no accidents. With him there are no accidents. When he created the vegetable world, he knew already what dreams the annual death and resurrection of the corn would cause to stir in pious pagan minds. He knew already that he himself must so die and live again, and in what sense, including and far transcending the old religion of the Corn King. He would say, "This is my body," Matthew chapter 26, verse 26, Mark chapter 14, verse 22, Luke chapter 22, verse 19, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 24. Common bread, miraculous bread, sacramental bread. These three are distinct, but not to be separated. Divine reality is like a fugue. All his acts are different, but they all rhyme or echo to one another. It is this that makes Christianity so difficult to talk about. Fix your mind on any one story or any one doctrine, and it becomes at once a magnet to which truth and glory come rushing from all levels of being. Our featureless pantheistic unities and glib rationalist distinctions are alike defeated by the seamless yet ever-varying texture of reality, the liveness, the elusiveness, the intertwined harmonies of the multidimensional fertility of God. But if this is the difficulty, it is also one of the firm grounds of our belief. To think that this was a fable, a product of our own brains as they are a product of matter, would be to believe that this vast symphonic splendor had come out of something much smaller and emptier than itself. It is not so. We are nearer to the truth in the vision seen by Julian of Norwich, when Christ appeared to her holding in his hand a little thing like a hazelnut, and saying, "This is all that is created." And it seemed to her so small and weak that she wondered how it could hold together at all.